Hello and welcome to this video about the basics of exponents, part 1. The learning target of this lesson is to understand how exponents work and how to apply the product and quotient rules. So we're going to take a couple minutes and go over some of the basics. Before we even get into the definitions and all that other stuff, I want to share a core idea. And this is something that is true for exponents pretty much any level of math. And my core idea here is that exponents are shorthand for repeated multiplication. And by shorthand, I mean it's just a faster way of saying something is being multiplied by itself over and over and over again. And so again, this is something that will continue to persist throughout different levels of math. And so if you understand that exponents at their core are just saying, something is being multiplied by itself several times over, that's going to help you as you get to more abstract ideas and applications of exponents. All right, now let's talk about some of the terminology. So when we have an exponent, we're talking, it is about, repeated multiplication. We have something that looks like this. And I'm going to get all very theoretical here for a second. I'll just use a lot of variables. All right, so we'll have a number raised to with a smaller number up top. The bigger number is going to be our base. The smaller number is the exponent. And that tells us how many times the base is being multiplied by itself. And then when you take the whole thing, let's just put it in a circle here, we call that the power. And so let's apply this with some actual numbers. So let's go 2 to the third. And so what we get here is that 2 is the base, 3 is the exponent. And if we want to, we have two ways of answering it. The power, 2 to the third, could be considered the power. Or we could say 8, which is 2 times 2 times 2, because that's what 2 to the third means, is that you're multiplying 2 by itself 3 times, is the power. So again, two ways you can kind of look at the power there. But that's our terminology: base, exponent, power. Now let's talk about what this looks like in expanded form and expanded out, because that's sort of what we did. So we take any number and we apply it to, or we put an exponent on it. So let's just say 5. What this means, and we can write this out, is what's called factored form: 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And so this is what we would call factor form. And so this comes from the fact that we have 2 as our base and then 5 as our exponent. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 2's. Now, this is an important idea when we start talking about rules and how to apply them. Because keep in mind, this is really difficult to have to write. That's, well, not really difficult, but it's tedious. And if you had to write it over and over and over again, that could really lead to a sore hand. So it's much easier to write 2 to the 5th. But when we think about these things being expanded out, that's going to help us arrive at some shortcuts for the rules. So we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do that, just one more thing I want to point out. This is huge. There's a big difference between something like, -2 squared versus, in parentheses, -2 squared. -2 squared here on the left, only the 2 is being squared. So this negative sign doesn't get to go around, doesn't get to come along for the sort of the power party, if you will, or the exponent party. It's 2 times 2. And then the negative sign is tagging along. And so the answer for this one is going to be -4. However, the parentheses are being squared. And so that's where the core idea comes into play. Repeated multiplication. The parentheses are getting repeated 2 times. So it's going to be -2 times -2. What's in the parentheses is being repeated. And so that gets us positive 4. Okay, does that make? I hope that makes a little bit of sense there. Here, only the 2 is being squared. Here, the 2 and the negative are squared, so the negative shows up twice and cancels out when you multiply them together. And then, just to take this idea one step further, negative 2 to the third is going to be negative, and then 2 times 2 times 2, because again, only the 2 is being raised to the third power there. And so that's going to get us negative 8. But if we do in parentheses negative 2 cubed, that's 3 sets of parentheses, each with a negative 2 in them. And when you multiply it out, you'll get positive 4 times negative 2 for negative 8. So sometimes the sign will still be negative. It just depends. And writing it out, expanding it out, really helps you see that. So now, let's talk about the product and quotient rules. So product, keep in mind, that means multiplication. Quotient means division. And what this is getting at is if we had something where we have a product or a quotient with the same base. Same base. So this only works if we have the same base. So I'm going to put that in a box. And so let's say for a product we had something like 2 to the 4th times 2 squared. So if we expand this out, we'll find out how many 2's there are. We have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. That's 2 to the 4th. Times 2 squared is 2 times 2. And then we just count them all up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 to the 6th. Now, the trick is that there's a rule that you can not have to do all this. Because remember, exponents are shorthand for repeated multiplication. And we want to, make life simple and easy. So what we can do is we can take the 2 exponents and add them together to get 2 to the 6th. Now again, this only works if you have the same base and you're multiplying them. And so that's the product rule. Now let's do the quotient rule. We'll take the same numbers. Let's go with 2 to the 4th. But now if it's a quotient, we're either going to write it as a fraction. And if we write it as a fraction, it kind of makes it a little easier for us to see how this works. Or you could actually write it with division. But fraction's probably how you're going to see it, and it's also more intuitive when we show the rule. So we'll write it out in expanded form. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 over 2 times 2. And what we can do is start canceling out some 2's. So like these 2 cancel each other out, those 2 cancel each other out, leaving us with 2 2's in the numerator. And so that gives us 2 squared. Now, likewise, we can find a way to apply a rule, which is 2 to the 4th, or so 2 to the 4th over 2 squared can be thought of as 2 to the 4th minus 2. And so with the quotient rule, what you do is you subtract the exponents. And that gets you 2 squared. So let's wrap up, or let's sum up the product and quotient rule here. So summing up the product rule, and quotient rule that is, first and most important is you have to have the same bases. Second is that if you are multiplying together, you add the exponents. If you are dividing, which will most likely appear as a fraction, so a over b, you subtract the exponents. And that's how you apply the product and quotient rules. So what I'm going to do is just on the next, or on this screen right here, do a few examples for you, just to kind of show you the process, and maybe some different numbers and a few different looks. So let's say we had something like 3 to the 5th times 3 to the 4th. Well, same base, multiplying them together, I add the exponents, and I write it as 3 to the 9th. And that, by the way, is a lot easier than having to actually multiply 3 by itself 9 times. And so that's, again, exponents are shorthand for repeated multiplication. They make life easy for us. Now, things can get a little more complicated if I maybe introduce a negative number as an exponent. And we'll talk more about what negative exponents or how we can deal with them more thoroughly later, but just to show you how you apply the product rule, it's 5 to the 10 plus negative 2, and 10 plus negative 2 is 8. And now we'll do some quotient rules. So let's say we had 4 to the 12th over 4 to the 5th. So since we are doing division, we will now subtract our exponents from each other. So we'll go 4, 12 minus 5, which is 4 to the 7th. And then one more example. Let's say we had 8 to the 6th over 8 to the 3rd. So that's 8 to the 6 minus 3, which is 8 to the 3rd. So hopefully that's been a nice sort of explanation of some of the basics with exponents. In the next couple of videos, we will explain them in more detail and continue to add more rules and kind of show different variations and how these can get even more complicated. But if you understand the basics, you should be fine, and you should understand how to do the more advanced stuff. So good luck with your practice or homework, and let me know if you have any questions.